Well, since he called on me last minute, I'm going to show you this. This is called If My People. It's a 40-day devotional prayer book for our country. And I'm going to read one out of that. It's from day 4. It says, "Now it shall come to pass, if you diligently obey the voice of the Lord your God, to observe carefully all his commandments, which I command you today, that the Lord your God will set you high above all nations on the earth. And all these blessings shall come upon you and overtake you, because you obey the voice of the Lord your God. Blessed shall you be in the city, and blessed shall you be in the country." And that's from Deuteronomy 28, verses 1 through 3. Let us pray. Gracious God, humble our hearts today so that we may hear your voice. Help us as a nation to obey your voice in all we say and do. Continue to bless us, O Lord, and give us a compassionate and giving heart toward those around us. Hold us to a higher calling, that we will carefully observe your commandments and be the nation under God with liberty and justice for all. Amen. And I have some of these if you would like to have one.
Thank you, Pat. Pat is the chaplain for the Jones County Republican Women, as well as the state organization, as I recall. So good to have you. Thank you. So let us stand for the pledge. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. God save the republic.
With that, let's move on to our speaker tonight. Steve King, many of you recognize his name. Some of you even thought maybe he was running for office. He's not. He's not running for office, at least in our part of the state anyhow at this point. But Steve has got a very interesting background and is very much familiar with what's going on with the carbon sequester or carbon pipeline that people are talking about. If you get the Cedar Rapids paper, you'll notice that there's been an article in there every day for this week, and various aspects of what's going on with this. Many people are in favor of it. Many are not, particularly landowners. So if I had 1,000 acres of corn, I wouldn't mind having $7 corn. But if I had a pipeline going through my farm and my yield drops 20 or 30 bushels per the acre for that strip, I might be opposed to it. So I'm going to let Steve tell us all about that. So start listening quickly so you can understand a little bit more about what's going on. Steve King from Chiron, Iowa.
Steve. Thank you, Gerald. Thanks a lot, Gerald. Well, thanks for the welcome and the chance to be here in Jones County and see how you do things here. One thing is you've got an army of veterans out here. Lots of folks stood up, and that was a good thing for me to see. And but I want to start out first, I think, with just give you a little bit of my background so that you can see why I'll say focused on the components of this CO2 pipeline boondoggle as it is. And if you just go back, I started a construction company in 1975. I had a negative net worth of $5,000. There's 2 reasons why you know I'm a good salesman. One of them is I have a good-looking wife, and the other one is I convinced a Democrat banker to loan me 100% on a bulldozer when I had a negative net worth of $5,000. Maryland was a harder sale, but it took me 7 years to get that done. But anyway, so we started this construction company up and rolled out this machine, and the engine blew up in the first 3 hours, so it set us back again. And about 10 days later, my wife Marilyn's out there on the tracks of a D7 with a 7-foot cheater pipe, and she's about 4 months pregnant with what would be our firstborn, torquing the head bolts on the D7. So that's our background and our roots. I don't have to tell you the rest of that story but today my oldest son David, he was the one that was the preborn while Marilyn was torquing the head bolts. He owns that company today. We started them really, really young in our family, and they're doing fine, and we're in our 49th year. Next year we will celebrate our 50th year for King Construction, and I told David the other day, I said, we're going to have one great big party, and I'm going to plan it all, and you're going to pay for it. So that we went through that earthwork, terraces, dams, waterways, underground, tiling and underground utility work is what it's morphed into now. And now it's spread out quite a lot. He's taken it up several levels. But that's a construction background. I built pipelines when I first got into the construction business when I was 19 years old. And so I've been out there swamping on the bending crew, helping a welder, and those aspects of all the things it has to do with from the ditch to the backfill of the pipeline. And I also drilled for oil, and went up and greased the top sheave on the derrick when it was full covered with ice. And so that's a piece of this thing that is a part of my mind too. And then I got to a place where I could see that what government was working against me. And once I got my company set up to deal with the rules that we had, then they'd change them. And so I would go down to the Capitol and look them in the eye and say, can't we just fix this non-controversial thing here? And every once in a while I'd see this, Steve would never do this, but I'd see their eyes glaze over. And what am I doing, wasting my time for my business down here talking to these people if they're not even listening to what I have to say? I took a day out of my life for this, and I can't even get a 2-minute message in, let alone get it processed. So eventually I ended up looking for somebody to run for state senator in my district because I wanted a state senator that would listen to me. And each person I thought would make a good state senator pointed their finger back at me, and I didn't know they were planning to herd me into the Iowa Senate, but they did. And so I spent 6 years there. And then when the congressional seat opened up and for the 2002 election, I entered into that primary and came out of that primary with winning the general election to go to Washington, representing the 5th congressional district at that time, starting in January of 2003. So, and my last day in Congress was in January of 2021. So it's 18 years there. I sat on the Ag Committee throughout most of all that I did, and also the Judiciary Committee, and chaired the Constitution Committee in the United States Congress. I've taken an oath to the Constitution, I think it's 12 times if I'm calculating it right, and each time an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And there's a reason why when you take an oath to the Constitution, you put your left hand on the Bible and you put your right hand up like this. And so the reason for that, in my opinion, is that that's so these people that don't keep their oath can't have their hand behind their back with their fingers crossed. And I'm frustrated with what I see. I see at really every level of office, people will take that oath, but when push comes to shove, too many of them break from that oath, and they decide that pragmatism trumps the Constitution. We can't let that happen. If pragmatism trumps the Constitution, pragmatism is flexible and malleable, and it can be whatever any one person or two people or three or a committee wants to call it. They're then not bound by, I'll say, the rules that are the foundation of American exceptionalism. And I define them often as by, well, what is the foundation of American exceptionalism? Most of them are the Bill of Rights: freedom of speech, religion, press, the right to keep and bear arms, no double jeopardy, the right to property, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. And that is a foundation of our free enterprise. George Washington said that freedom and property rights are inseparable. You cannot have one without the other. And so that's something that I have hung on to because I've had my feet under the kitchen table of hundreds and hundreds of family farms throughout the years and the work we were doing. And the history of my family too. I know what this land means to people. And when someone comes along, then they're going to condemn your private property in order to advance their private gain, their private company. I'll just say it this way, is that I knew when about 3 years ago they first started the plan on these CO2 pipelines, and they began pushing it, and I'd heard about some of it before then, but it was coming home to Iowa. And you had Summit and you had Navigators. And the Navigators grew out of the left, out of the World Economic Forum and the people that fly under the blue Democrat flag. And Summit grew out of Bruce Rastetter flying the red Republican flag. But they both said, we're not going to ask for eminent domain. We will negotiate for these easements, so it'll be fine. And I knew it was a boondoggle anyway. I knew it was hundreds of billions of dollars of wasted money on an idiotic plan that will cause this generation to be known as not the greatest generation, but the stupidest generation, for bleeding ourselves dry out of here and handing all the money over to China in more ways than I can even list. But I knew that if they start down this path and they're going to dig and bulldoze their way through the best farmland in the world, they're not going to get through that without eminent domain, because we have so many families out here whose roots go down deep into this land, 5 and 7 generations. And I probably have met 3 generations or 4 out of the 5 and 7 in some of these families that are there. And there's not a piece of ground out there that's not a family farm that family didn't only sweat into. They bled into that land. And it's being held and prepared and handed for ready for the next generation. And that's the legacy of the family that's there. This isn't just a piece of dirt that can be replaced with a check or swapping it off for another farm. That's your heritage. That's where your memories are. That's where your legacy is. And so when they come through and say, we're going to condemn your land, I knew there would be hundreds of people that stood up and said, no, you won't. I own this land. And if you were a public utility, if you were providing a service, if you had a commodity that we had access to, then that's a different story. And they would be open to those negotiations. And if that property were condemned under eminent domain, they would understand that that is what we have to have if we're going to have a functioning country. But if someone can come along that has more political power and more money than you do, and make a claim to government, whether it's the state government or the local government, that they want your land, if that can go, we don't have any free enterprise left anymore. Free enterprise is one of those pillars of American exceptionalism, and free enterprise would be gone. Can you imagine who would set up a donut shop or a gas station or a machine shop or a factory or a warehouse or anything if someone else could come along and claim that property? Just to give you an example, by the way, Bruce Rastetter did try to set up one of those things in southern Tanzania. And he wanted to set up a big mega farm down there when he was the chairman of the Board of Regents and use Iowa State's foundation there to do 325,000 acres of land. It required, though, that a lot of the people on that land would have to have eminent domain. Tanzania has that authority with just a flip of the switch. They can take your property from government, which is one of the reasons why it cannot be a prosperous place in Tanzania until they've got property rights. And I work in there just a little bit, so I pick up some of that background. But property rights are essential. And so that's the big thing for me when I didn't believe they could get this done without eminent domain. When they claimed eminent domain a year ago, last March, I believe it was, that's what lit me up then, because it's just like, I knew it. I knew they would try this, and now they're going to try to bulldoze their way through our constitutional property rights, and that's what lit me up. So I wanted to see the whole picture of this thing, the big picture. And I'm not one of those guys where they like to, in Congress, they like to hand you some talking points and say, repeat these over and over again. Don't do it mindlessly because it looks a little obvious, but just repeat them over and over again. I can't do that. I've got to know the foundation of what we're talking about and believe in it. So I holed up in my office for 3 weeks and just drilled down into the World Economic Forum, the origins of this carbon situation, which I had a decent background in because I'd been debating them across Europe multiple times in the previous years. And so what it came back with was this idea, the global warming idea, goes back a long, long ways. In fact, it's rooted in testimony by James Edward Hansen, Dr. James Edward Hansen, whom I didn't know, but I was going to school with him at Denison at the time. And he became a PhD professor that testified before Congress in August. I don't know what they were doing there in August. A hot day, and no air conditioning in the building at that time, 1986. And he convinced Congress that, yes, this earth is getting warmer and we've got to do something about it because we'll be the boiling frogs someday if we don't. And that just started the thing rolling. But I think it already had begun some of that over across Europe. And in my time there, I think, for example, I had pretty good relations with some of the members of the Bundestag. And I can think of one of them that represented a rural area west of Munich down in Bavarian region. And he said, I agree with you. I don't believe there is such a thing as global warming, and I don't think it's happening the way they say, and I don't think we can control it if it is. And I said, good. Did you tell your constituents that? No, I wouldn't dare do that. Well, why not? Because they'll put me out of office. Oh, well, how about I come over there and you stand with me and I'll tell them. No, can't do that either. So I tell that story because the political leverage and also political contributions and all the money that's been poured into this has maybe not changed everybody's opinion that says it has been changed, but they're afraid to tell you what they really think because they're afraid there's a consequence. They're afraid they'll lose their seat. They're afraid they'll lose their friends or their business associates. And I just never really had the instincts to watch out for those kind of things, you may know. So I give you the European side of this thing because it gave me a way to understand what was going on there and how it grew out of Europe and then flowed through and launched by the World Economic Forum and Klaus Schwab and those. They knew what they were doing. And in the end, they were setting up an international currency called carbon credits. And they've got that credit today, those credits today. And if you own them, you can sell them. There's a global market for them. And it's the same, kind of like a Bitcoin, only this is a bit worse than the Bitcoin, a lot worse actually. So I watched what was going on there. I debated it over there with them. When I came to Congress, I remember very early on, I'm down on the floor, and here is Ed Markey from Massachusetts, and he's going on about cap and trade. Well, that's the foundation of this carbon credit market that we have, was cap and trade then, and they pushed that through. The Democrats believed it, and the Republicans generally said, no, we don't believe it, until this big appropriation came in Joe Biden's Inflation Reduction Act. And that Inflation Reduction Act took this 45Q credit for CO2 to $85 a metric ton. And the people that are lined up to rake that money in, they were lined up well before that appropriation was available. I remember Bruce Rastetter saying, well, the credit's at $50 now. We don't think that's quite enough. We think it's going to go to 85. And that's exactly what it did. It went right to 85. And I can't imagine how that can happen. Let me see. The Secretary of Agriculture would probably have as much to say about that as anybody in Biden's cabinet. Well, you know who that is, Tom Vilsack. And let me see, he would have some conduit in with the Summit operation because Summit's general counsel is who? Jess Vilsack, his son. And then on the other side of this coin, you've got Terry Branstad, who was the ambassador to China, who was the senior policy advisor for Summit. And then a couple of his boys are working there too. And I know those boys, and I've hunted with Marcus, and I like the way he handles a gun. He's a good guy. But they're working that whole side of this thing. And then so I saw this coming together this way. When that happened, it just lit me up. And so I got digging in deeper and built more foundation for it. I wrote an article that is posted on a lot of places, but it's posted on our website. freesoilcoalition.com is our website. The title of the article is The Anatomy of a Boondoggle. And I tell in there the whole story, about as much story as I can get on a couple, 3 pages, of how this all came together, the World Economic Forum side of this thing, the Republican side of this. And when you had Navigator proposing their plan, especially over here in this part of the state, Navigator, it was 85% owned by BlackRock, which is controlled by Larry Fink. Larry Fink controls over $10 trillion by now. And his plan was to start up in South Dakota, run his pipeline down through, picking up ethanol plants down across the river into Illinois, and pump it down into the ground near the oil fields of Decatur, Illinois. That was his plan. And Bruce Rastetter's plan under Summit was to start in eastern Iowa, gather the ethanol plants he can negotiate going across eastern Iowa, some out of Nebraska, southwest Minnesota, South Dakota, terminating up in North Dakota near Bismarck, near the oil fields, but not in them, they always say. And so I looked at this when I got the maps, laid them across each other. I looked at them and let me see. These pipelines cross each other 15 times that I can count on the map. That doesn't look like a very smart business model to me. Why would you have all of that duplicity going on? And they run the opposite direction. One of them runs from the east to the northwest. The other one runs from the northwest to the southeast. And so then I started to think about, okay, what would give you the audacity to believe that you can set up a plan like this and bulldoze your way through our constitutional right to property? And I'm thinking, Larry Fink, $10 billion, the World Economic Forum. He's on the board. He sits there with George Soros. Rubs elbows with George Soros, by the way, and with Klaus Schwab. But if you're Larry Fink and you want to do this, you're thinking you have to run through property rights, and you're coming up into all red states up here. Populous governors in Iowa, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, not so much in Minnesota or Illinois. And Larry Fink didn't have a shot at that because our governors would have stood up and said, you're not going through our property. We've got property rights. You're a private entity for private gain. Constitution says you can't have eminent domain. That's what I'm predicting would have happened. And so would the leaders in our legislatures. But so instead of that, I think Bruce Rastetter and Summit got the mission of, you've got to plow the first furrow up through here. You're the one that's got to get the eminent domain. And once that path is cleared, then Navigator can come through. Well, I don't know if I was right on that because Navigator pulled out. before they got to that point that I expected to happen. But something got talked about for business, and Summit said the next day we're perfectly positioned to pick up the Navigator pipelines. Turns out that is what they did and are doing. And now they're into phase 2 of this. And so that's some of the dynamics that took place. Some of the things we're thinking about here is, first of all, I want to give you a little bit on the constitutional background, or where they think they might have a chink in our constitutional armor on property rights. And that is, in 2006, there was a decision made by the United States Supreme Court called the Kelo decision. Kelo versus New London, Connecticut. And the circumstances were this, that the city of New London, Connecticut had an economic development plan, and in order to exercise their plan, they decided if we condemn Suzette Kelo's house and that of her neighbors, we can bulldoze those houses out of there, and we can build a pharmaceutical factory with Pfizer, and we'll also we'll be able to do some shopping malls and things of that nature. They don't pay much property tax. We'll get more property tax out of that. We'll get economic development. That was their rationale. So they condemned her property, but they already had a deal to hand it over to a developer. They really, if they had it in their possession, it was just to transfer it to the developer. And Suzette Kelo said no. And the Institute for Justice went all the way to the Supreme Court with her, and in the end they lost on a 5-4 decision. And so the next Wednesday morning, I had Justice Scalia as my guest speaker for the breakfast that I hosted every Wednesday morning for 16 years. And we had quite a lot of members of Congress that morning. They showed up, you can imagine. But across the table from me, I'm the chair and he's across as a guest. And as I brought this up, he knew that's what we came to talk about. He looked me in the eye with those dark, penetrating eyes, and he said, Kelo is an erroneous decision, and it will be reversed one day. And that just burned into my soul, and it still drives me. But the thing that they made for that decision that changed the Fifth Amendment was, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. They inserted, John Paul Stevens wrote the majority opinion, they inserted the words, or public purpose. Public use or public purpose. Now, the word purpose is much broader than public use. And so we could define public purpose to be most anything. And now people are saying publicly, including our governor, by the way, well, it's for the public good. And I don't know, we raise kids and words get pushed on their definitions, but when you get to the public good, isn't public purpose broad enough? You have to call it the public good? And whose idea of what is good? I think it's good to protect our constitutional rights. I think it's good to have actual free enterprise where I have an opportunity. I think it's good to reduce regulations and taxes where you can. And it's good when people are moral and they raise their babies the right way and make the society better. Those are all goods, but there's contradictions. People would disagree with me out on the streets and everything I've said with that. But so the public good is a broad term. It's kind of like the word fair. If anybody that's raised 2 or more kids knows there's no such thing as fair. It's like, okay, you're fighting over this candy bar. One of you cut the candy bar in half, the other one chews first. Well, you're going to make me cut it first. That way he's going to take the big piece. There's no way you settle that. When you get into the word fair, good is almost the same category, but that's what's working. They're speaking words into law, into effect. And I hear that come out of the mouths of state legislators, that the discussion just got to that, and it gets in your head, and it slips out when you say it, and then it reinforces it. So as I saw this coming, I thought, I know where this is going to go. It's got to go to the Supreme Court of the United States. Well, first, before I go to the legal side of this, I better touch bases on the danger of this CO2. And I didn't take this all that seriously when I first got involved in it. For me, it was only the constitutional rights and property rights. But the more I learned about CO2 and how dangerous it is, the more concerned I am. And so they say, well, we have a plume study. And they know where the plume's going to go. They call it a plume. And that's, I don't think that term fits very well, but Cindy Golding calls it a kill zone. And I agree with her, that hits home, it is a kill zone. But they have this study that supposedly they're going to tell our emergency personnel how to react if there is, they call it, a release in the pipeline. And a release. 2,200 pounds pressure in a 24-inch pipeline, and you're going to call that a release? I mean, if I had one of my bulldozer operators come to me or an excavator operator and go, well, 2,200 pounds pressure in our hoses, by the way, I just had a release. Really? go change your pants. I need somebody that's a man to run this thing. and so, but they use these terms to sugarcoat this. If it's a release, it's going to be a rupture. And there was a rupture in Satartia, Mississippi, in 2020, I believe it was, on February 22nd, if I'm not mistaken. 24-inch line, and this line was covered by 30 feet of dirt because it went under a road there. But we finally had a scientist that explained this. For nearly a quarter of a mile, they had all this rain, and there was a slip plate in that soil. And so you might get those where sometimes glacial clay has got those layers in it, and when you get rain, it'll just slide. Well, it slid for about a quarter of a mile, and it just put more and more stress on that 24-inch pipe with 2,200 pounds pressure in it. It had to break somewhere, and it did right beside a road. And when it blew a hole, it was a 40-foot deep hole by the time it blew out of there. So 10 feet below the pipe, 30 feet above, a big blast hole, and that CO2 roared out of there. Satartia, Mississippi is a mile away from that lake, from that rupture, and they finally evacuated the town, 200 people in the town, but there are people in the rural areas too. And it put 45 people in the hospital. Some of them were near death, and some of them were saved by the emergency workers who had their scuba gear, their Scotty air packs that they burned. They used up 98 of them trying to save people. They saved everybody, but 45 of them went to the hospital. And there's people that went to the hospital that are at least a half a mile away, but that's the narrative that we can get. Further than that, most likely, in Satartia, if they hadn't gotten them evacuated, likely would have lost some people there too. Sure. The reason they had to go to the hospital is CO2 is an asphyxiant. It's colorless, odorless, tasteless. You can't see it, and it just pushes the oxygen out. They're used in fire extinguishers because it takes the oxygen away and puts the fire out. And we use it to euthanize hogs in the packing plants. I've been up there to be part of that. I want to make sure I was eyes on, hands on. We put about 20 head of hogs in an elevator, roll them down on the elevator, leave them down there for 90 seconds, bring them back up. They're all dead. Then they go off to slaughter. It's a handy little thing to take care of hogs with, but human beings, same thing. As tragic as this is, the dangerous part is it's heavier than air. So it goes down the valley, it settles in the low places, and you can't see it or you can't sense it, that it's even there. And there is the most stark example of what CO2 can do to human beings is 1986 in Cameroon in Africa. There is a lake there called Lake Nyos, N-Y-O-S, Lake Nyos, and it's about a mile square, only it's round, but about a section of a water area. And there was a natural burp out of Mother Nature that pushed this CO2 up into the atmosphere, and it blows up kind of like a mushroom. It goes up not very far, 100 or 200 feet, depending on the pressure, and then it just rolls right back down to the ground, and then it travels horizontally, and it travels with the wind, and the colder it is, the lower it stays, and the longer it stays. It wasn't that cold in Lake Nyos, but it went down the valley with the outlet of the lake, and there were villages down there. It killed 1,746 people. And they just dropped dead in their tracks wherever they were, doing whatever they were doing. And I watched the video of an individual, might be the first one, that walked down in there after the air had cleared. And it was just a video of him describing it. And he told about all the people that were dead laying down wherever they were. Then there was 3,000 to 4,000 head of cattle were killed. I've seen pictures of that. 50 cattle here just all laying dead, and in one shot that I can recall. But every chicken, every animal, and he said the eeriest thing was of all of that death that was there, the humans, the cattle, all the animals, there wasn't the sound of a single buzzing fly. It killed all of them too. Anything that breathed was dead. And it was in the furthest away that there was a fatality was 14 miles down that valley. Now, it was a larger volume than we're likely to see in this pipeline, and you need to qualify that. But it tells you what this can be. And yesterday, during the day, and last night in the meeting, I was at Charles City. And Charles City has an economic development plan that they bought 75 acres of ground there, the only direction Charles City can really grow, and they paid a premium for it, $28,000 an acre. Then they They poured some stub streets in there, put a little water in, and got some utilities ready for their development. Well, Summit insists that they go right through the middle of that 75 acres. And that $28,000 land becomes probably $12,000 land. And that means that Charles City can't grow. But what really matters, I mean, to me, my legal mind says this. This is the exact antithesis of what they did in the Kelo decision in New London, Connecticut. That being the Charles City and Floyd County, it's a Charles City Area Development Corporation. They borrowed money, they bonded money to buy that piece of ground and develop it. And so this is the opposite of what they have at Kelo. You have a private company that wants to go through public development land that has an economic development plan. And so this gets to court, and the justices are going to have to look at this and say, let me see if it justified letting the pharmaceutical company take Suzette Kelo's land. How do you justify, because they had an economic development plan, how do you justify taking the economic development plan from Charles City and handing it over to the private developer or the private investment? It is a perfect case, juxtaposes the Kelo decision perfectly, and we figured that out about a year and a half ago. I made a trip over there right away and spoke to their group, and now they're plaintiffs in our lawsuit. And so that's, I guess I'll hit that piece also. So as I watched this, I knew that we were going to end up going to court because the Iowa Utilities Board, now commission, the personalities and people on there looked to me like they knew what their job was before they ever took their oath. And I just concluded that that was the risk that we had, and we had to prepare for that. And they've proven it to me over and over again. In fact, they've denied me to testify under law. Legally, an individual can step up and apply to be an intervener and then testify before the Utilities Commission and on why this is a bad idea. I did that. They denied me. I hired a lawyer to do it. They denied me. Then I formed the King Interveners. That's a group of 7 or 8 of us that have interests that we want to protect and get our message into the Utilities Board. And that was all under the law. Those things had been approved before. Not again. They wouldn't allow me to testify a second time for the King Interveners. So the third time was the family of Don and Carol Hennings. They've got land on the east side of Sioux City. And it's development land, 104 acres, and they've already sold some off at $20,052 an acre, something like that. And if Sioux City is going to grow, they have to grow east into this ground. That's why Don and Carol Hennings bought that land. And so Summit insists on going through the middle of that piece of ground, and she had heart surgery and called me up and said, I can't go testify, will you do it for me? I said, yes, I will. I drove to Sioux City, spent the better part of a day looking over their land and listening to her presentation out of the stacks of paperwork that had been presented to her, and prepared myself. She called down and said, I can't come because the doctor's orders, but I've asked Steve King to represent me. And they said, okay, that's fine. Signed me up. I went there, checked in. They gave me a witness tag around my neck. And when it was time for the Hennings Family Trust, they called that. I went up and sat down to take the oath. Eric Hillen, the chairman of that committee, looked at me and he said, what are you doing here? And well, they all knew that it was me that was coming. I was all registered in. He knew what I was doing there, but that was a rhetorical question, I think. And I said, I'm here to represent the Hennings family, Carol Hennings. He said, we know about her health. And he went into recess. They went behind the curtain. In 5 minutes, he came out and he said, well, you're not going to be allowed to testify. And I opened my mouth and no response allowed. They cut my mic. And so, but that button's right there for me too. And I pushed it back on again. I said, I'll see you in court. And that's where we are today. By the way, we filed court against them on Monday night, sometime about 9:30 or something. We got the filing in. But so I saw what I thought was going to happened over and over again. And that's the reason that I formed the Free Soil Foundation. It's a 501c3, and it allows for tax-deductible contributions to go into that fund, and 100% of them go for attorney fees in this litigation that we're in. So we filed in federal court and we filed in state court on Monday night, and we're going to battle this thing through as long as it takes, as far as we have to go, because I'm not going to allow our children, our grandchildren, every succeeding generation lose their right to property. And we're the tip of the spear here. If we can defend this, if we can defend our constitutional rights and defend our right to property, and tell these people that want eminent domain for private gain to pack up and go home, we won't have it here. But if your checkbook's big enough, go ahead and negotiate. If it's not big enough, hit the road. That's what we need to say to them. And if we can preserve that, we can preserve our family farmland. We can preserve all the property that we have in the cities, in the suburbs, in the countryside, and we can preserve our way of life, and we can preserve free enterprise itself. And if we fail to do that, we've handed this curse that's coming at us over to the next generations to try to live with the mess that's created if you don't have a right to property, and we devolve down into, say, Tanzania. So that's some of this. Oh, wait, there's a little more. Free Soil Foundation formed also, not just for this litigation in Iowa, but I'm looking at this across the states that are affected. North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Iowa, Illinois, not so much right now, and Southwest Minnesota. So the idea was form an organization that pulled people together from all of these states so that we're communicating across state lines and we're not being divided and conquered by one state or another. And so because of that now, I've spoken in all those states that I've mentioned, not Minnesota, but the others, the Dakotas, Nebraska, Iowa, Illinois, all on this topic. And up in Bismarck at the Northwest Landowners Association, that's 26 states that are represented in that association. They're doing battle up there. And it was... After I finished up there, I went over to the hospital in Bismarck. It's a pretty big facility. I wanted to go over there and see what was in the parking lot. And if you go there into the parking lot at Bismarck, North Dakota, you will see this square frame white farmhouse, pretty nice square frame. Well, it's not a farmhouse anymore, I guess, but it's in the middle of the parking lot. It's got asphalt all around it. It's got about a 4-foot retaining wall with steps going to it. And that's the woman that lives there. I presume it's a woman, I don't know, but they hold their principles as good as men do all the time. So I say that, but the individual that lives in that house is somebody that said, no, I don't care how big your check is, you can build your parking lot here and I can't stop you, but on this ground, this is mine. And so I took pictures of that, admired it, put it into my memory. And this is going to be vague the way I say this, but the Earl of Chatsworth in 1676 made a statement about it really was the foundation for a man's home as his castle. And he said he can live in a shack, he can live in a hovel. The boards can be flapping in the breeze, the wind can be blowing through, the snow can be in, the rain can get in. But he said, but the King of England dare not cross that threshold without that man's permission. That's the foundation for property rights that we have that goes clear back to way back into Old English common law, and it is the root in our Constitution. And by the way, the Iowa Constitution is stronger yet than even the federal Constitution when it comes to property rights. So that's this has to be one. We have a pretty good bunch of assets to work with, good plaintiffs along the way. Not only Charles City, but the Hennings family that I told you about. I better not go down through all of that, but we have right now 7 plaintiffs, and I've rounded up about 5 of those, and I've got 1 more at least to add to this thing as it goes. And the more plaintiffs we have, the easier it is to raise money, and the stronger our case is. So. And then I supported Vivek Ramaswamy in this primary here because I couldn't get an answer out of any of these presidential candidates on this topic. They would not respond. And Vivek was clear. He told the truth. If you listen to him, I got to know him quite a lot. I was on the bus with him for weeks. And he's with us on this. He stepped up to defend us on this on the 4th of December last year. And as he said multiple times publicly, he said, I'm with you, whether I'm president or whatever I am, I'm with you to the end of this, and I'm going to stand with you on it and help you. So that's nice to have that asset in place too. And I'm going to be strongly supporting President Trump. There isn't any doubt about that. He's a guy that can bring this country out of the mess that we've been drugged down into. And he's got to be really aggressive when that time comes. He's got to have the right people in place. He's got to be aggressive. And last time, I think he got too many people that he just thought that Democrats were patriotic, and they seemed to be, they want power, but their patriotism wasn't so strong. And so I'm hopeful that this can all happen, and I appreciate the focus that we're going to have on the elections. And I don't have to worry about whether there's going to be clean ballots here in Jones County. didn't worry about it when I came. Now I really don't worry about it. It's going to be good. But across the rest of the country, we've got a lot of teams doing a lot of things to try to clean this thing up, and it doesn't mean we can do enough. Then also, I watched the debate night before last. What do I say there? I didn't really realize that Kamala was programmable, but they programmed her, and it would be like, okay, here's the question that she knew was coming, and somebody's back there pulls the string behind her back, and out it came. But you know, I thought she was the most vacuous candidate I'd ever seen, and she really she did better than I expected. I'll put it that way. But here's what we need to do. The pundits say, well, she won the debate, and 2 or 3 days of that, we need to bring out what Trump had to say and pin that on him. Like, for example, put your MAGA hat on. You might as well put your MAGA hat on. You switched and grabbed all my policies. And what about fracking? They're standing in Pennsylvania. Well, she can flip on fracking. And what about, well, you would kill babies 7th, 8th, and 9th month. Would never answer that. Those things need to be put back on her. But when he called her a Marxist, that's what she is. When I went to Congress in 2003, Bernie Sanders was sitting in the House. And sitting there one night talking to some members, just getting to know them, and they told me Bernie Sanders is a socialist. And I couldn't believe there'd be a socialist in the United States Congress in 2003. And I said, I don't believe that. Well, go ask him. So I said, well, I will. So I went over and sat down next to Bernie, introduced myself, had a little chat, and then when the timing was right, I said, Bernie, those guys tell me you're a socialist. Is that true? Yeah, I'm a socialist. He told me that he is a socialist. Now, the significant majority of the Democrats, at least in the House, are socialists. And they had what it was to be the Democratic Socialists of America managed the Progressives website. They were one and the same. And so I went down and called them out on that, and they changed it after a while. But that website started out, Democratic Socialists of America starts out and says, we are not communists. Now, that's a great sales pitch. I don't think you could sell any real estate with that opening. We are not communists. We are socialists. Communists want to nationalize everything. We only want to nationalize the Fortune 500 companies and operate them for the benefit of the people affected by them. That was right in there. It's been taken down now, but that's so they are. So we have a huge social movement against this. It's been undercutting the woke crowd that's there, our children that have had their minds corrupted sitting in our schools, and this has all got to be reversed. It's been coming at us for a generation and a half now, and the poison's sitting there. And some people just can't think straight anymore. So I just encourage people, and young people, I see them and I say, the best thing good young people can do is have a lot of babies and raise them right. That's the best thing. And by the way, everyone's tax deductible. Every one of them's loved by God. It's a hard sell when you're not making a lot of money, I know. But anyway, I promised that I would open up for some questions on that. I didn't get to a very wise conclusion, but I did get to say some of the things that makes me feel better. And so anything you want to say or ask, I'll go back to Ben first, back in the back.
Now, when people ask you, well, how come we can't get some mass rail transit like China's been able to build in the last 20 years? Because China doesn't have private property rights. So you remember that, because that's come up with the Green New Deal stuff. I've been working like mad trying to get ordinance passed in Dubuque County to block this sort of monstrosity. I'm also trying to get it done at the small local town level as an extra onion layer to the equation. Dubuque County will be joining that ordinance that have been done by a lot of the states in the north side of Iowa. But does it matter if the localities also do a similar ordinance to add an extra layer to that onion to protect them? Because it's my understanding that ordinances are 2 miles out past city limits. This is how they're effective. Is that true?
I think it matters. All ways that we can add on to this, it matters. And so the counties that have added on, Shelby County has been the lead. Steve Kinkle, chairman of the board in Shelby County, and he's put out a document that's got 14 or more different things that he recommends that the counties can do. That's on our website also at freesoilfoundation.com. And in fact, we've got a lot of information on there. It's kind of become a good reference location. And so that, and the ordinances have been passed by Shelby County, have been passed by a number of other counties. Some of those counties passed them and said, but they aren't enacted until Shelby County is no longer being litigated against, or some words to that effect. You can do that if you need to. I'd rather see it just be, let's all pile on here and take part of this. But most of the counties have insurance policy that will pay some of the attorney fees anyway. There's also a resolution that came out of Bremer County, written by Corey Serwinski, county supervisor up there. It's about a 3-page resolution, whereas, and it goes down through the constitutional rights and the free enterprise endeavor that's coming at them, and rejects Summit and their CO2 boondoggle eloquently and legally and philosophically. That's also on our website. So those two things, especially those directions on there, would help. And nobody can just start and invent the wheel from the beginning. This stuff has been pushed and massaged now for I suppose going on 2 years now. But that's what I would recommend is let's get everybody on this. There are at least 9 counties that filed suit, or they're planning to file suit against the IUC now and Summit. Those suits have not been filed yet. They've got until the 14th to do that. But I think we'll see ours is in there, both state and federal, and we filed as Free Soil Foundation, as well as the other plaintiffs that I mentioned, and the King Interveners as plaintiffs as well. But you will see the counties, at least 9 counties come in on this, and that'll be Tim Whipple's lawsuit. He'll be the attorney on that. You'll see the Sierra Club also file, and you'll see the Geordie Landowners. That's an attorney firm out of Omaha, and he's gathered together about 250 landowners in Iowa that he's got for clients. He will file also. So there'll be 4 big efforts coming at Summit and the Iowa Utilities Commission to try to shut this down. And I think the litigation process will run on for a long time. They're telling us that, well, they'll be pumping CO2 through this pipeline in 2026. And I think about half the litigation might be done by 2026. So that's how that looks to me. And I'd encourage every entity that can weigh in, because it takes some of the load off the rest. Thanks, Ben. Yes, sir.
What can people like us that maybe not own farms, what can we do to help that out?
Well, I mean, I didn't really come here to ask for money, but you can go to the website and click that button. That would be a start. And every dime of it goes to attorney fees, by the way. And nobody has taken any money out for expenses. It's just we pay our own gas, we do our own travel, all of that stuff, because we want that fund to grow. That's one thing. But talk to all your neighbors and your friends and whatever you have for family and network, and try to bring them to this so that there's a broad knowledge base that comes in. I said outside, or maybe it was to Gerald coming in, that they asked me to do an interview for a book that's being written on this, and there's an attorney putting this book together. We did 4.5 hours of interview, and we didn't get done. It says, I'm going to have to take a break and come back and study this over and come back for another round. It's very, very deep. There's lots of pieces, lots of moving parts in it. So that's one thing is spread the word. Spread the word wherever you can. And if you go to the website and start reading into that, that might just, that should spark some.
Give him that information so when he sends out his email.
Yeah. Also, I meant to say, I'll come right back to you, Linda.
Don't forget that Free Soil also is on Facebook, so anybody on Facebook can follow it.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. It's on. You can follow it on Facebook. And one of the things that I meant to tell you is that the Summit is saying that they have a permit, and they got a final disposition and order in June, but it says you can't act on this until there's a disposal site in North Dakota, there's a route approved in North Dakota, and that there's a route approved in South Dakota. And until those 3 things are met, you can't move here in Iowa. Those are the conditions. So right away, Lee Blank, the CO2 of Summit, put out a letter that said, we have a permit. And so now we're going to come talk to you about whether you're going to sign this easement or whether we're going to use eminent domain. And that's in his letter, and I've got a copy of it. Did they win?
Did South Dakota say no?
They have. I'll go through this piece, Jared, because it's not quite that clean. So anyway, he said that, and that they have a permit. And so I started giving my speeches around saying they don't have a permit. Calling it a permit does not make it a permit. And that was starting to stick. And then the Utilities Commission put out a press release that said, well, we've now issued a permit to Summit. Well, these conditions were not met. And they said that they expected Summit would substantially meet these conditions, so therefore here's a permit. So the Utilities Commission called it a permit. So we put out again, calling it a permit doesn't make it a permit, no matter how many times you want to say so. If you don't have permission that goes with a permit, it's not a permit. And so that's kind of the battle that we're in right now a little bit. But so here's what's going on. In North Dakota, they do not have a disposal site, a dump site. And they want to pump that CO2 down into 6,000 feet down into what the people in South Dakota tell me it's a saltwater sand bucket. And 6,000 feet down, they have to pump it up to 3,000 pounds pressure to get it down in there. And so, matter can neither be replaced nor destroyed, and so it's going to displace something. And it'll push that sand somewhere, and it'll turn that into carbonic acid, is what the people up there tell me. So they don't have a place to dump it in North Dakota. They don't have a route in North Dakota, and it's being litigated up there about whether they can even put it down into the ground because of the pore space rights where they would store it. It's kind of like property, or kind of like mineral rights. That's being litigated up there. That's North Dakota. South Dakota, they could not get a permit approved, and so Summit's 12 to 20 lobbyists in Pierre last session, they pushed through a piece of legislation called Landowners' Bill of Rights, which is already. If what it says like that, it's the opposite, isn't it? And so the Landowners' Bill of Rights took local control away from the counties that would take care of the siting and the permit process and the ordinances, which we talked about, Ben, and give that over from the local to the Public Utilities Commission, which is a 3-person commission. And then, so that means that Summit pushed this because here's what I see how this works. If you've got 3 people on a commission and you've got the weight of the world on you, and you've got one person on either side of that, I'm for it, he's against it, the person in the middle is ambivalent, they're going to cave to the money and the power. They will cave to the money and the power, and Summit knows that. So they wanted it into the 3-person commission's hands and away from local. Well, they got that legislation passed, and of course Governor Nome signed it. And then, but the people in South Dakota figured it out, and their back came up. And so they brought a referendum. They needed 17,600 signatures to get a bill to repeal this Landowners' Bill of Rights and put it back the way it was so that local control decides. And so they came out back with between 34 and 38,000 signatures, twice as much as they needed. And they had primary elections in South Dakota. The Republicans up there that were for the pipeline, and they did what Bruce Rastetter wanted them to do and what some of that money wanted them to do. 14 Republicans incumbents were defeated in the primary in South Dakota in June, and they're all people that were pushing for this pipeline. It changes dramatically what's going on in that place. So we have, and by the way, the Supreme Court of South Dakota had a decision to make on, it was a property rights issue on surveying, actually, and there was a repeal that came from the 3rd and 5th Circuit to the South Dakota Supreme Court, and they ruled that Summit is not a common carrier. They're not transporting a commodity, and so therefore they don't qualify for eminent domain, and they're not a public utility, and so they don't qualify for eminent domain. But they remanded it back to the circuits with the rules on that, and they acknowledged also that Summit had done 4 lame things to try to claim that they were those things, but they wrote in their decision essentially nice words that said, just because you say so doesn't make it true, and we don't believe you. So they've got a big battle in South Dakota through the courts, a big battle legislatively, and a session coming up. We're working with all these people, by the way, in the legislatures across these states. And in North Dakota, they've got litigation on the pore spaces, they call it, to come up with yet. I think, and if we do our part down here, all of us together, we can hold this to where we can hold our property rights together. But that's, again, a long answer to a non-question. So, yes, ma'am.
I think a lot of people got this from Black Hills Energy Company, where for as low as $5 a month, you can pay in to Black Hills, and it goes for the purchase of carbon credits.
Oh.
Yeah, and they do that. Yeah. I mean, we're not going to do it, but
I want to see that because I'll maybe take a picture of it, but I hadn't seen that nor had I heard that, but I'm not surprised at that. Okay, so there's another short question with a long answer. Can I still do this, Gerald? Okay, because so I told you a little bit about Bruce Rastetter, and you're probably as close to him geographically as I am. But we know that he started out in, started out in the hog business, and that was with Iowa Select, and he got separated with Jeff Hansen. Then he started a feed business, and that feed went to Jack DeCoster's chickens. If you remember Jack DeCoster, we had to, sue him out of Iowa. But then Rastetter got involved in the ethanol business. He built 4 ethanol plants, Hawkeye Renewables. 2 of them went bankrupt in about 2008, and he convinced the judge to name him as the CEO to get the companies out of bankruptcy that he'd managed that went into bankruptcy. Now, I know it was a tough time for ethanol with $8 corn. It was. So that's part of the factor, but that just seemed ironic to me. That's how that worked. Then his activity, he got completely out of the ethanol business, and I'm talking to people across the board in this. Where did Bruce Rastetter go? Nobody knew. Where's his money? I'd ask him. He said, no, he doesn't have anything in any ethanol plant here in Iowa. And so I'm one of those insomnia things. I'm going around the internet following whatever rabbit trail, and I find this little story that says that 18,000 acres of Sandhills land in Nebraska has been sold by Summit Farms. 18,000 acres, quite a lot, even if it's Sandhills. So, all right, I put that in my memory, and a year or two later, I was just kind of driving down the road, and I'm thinking about this fella that builds ethanol plants, and he's a friend, and I called him up and said, Dave, what are you doing? Well, I'm building an ethanol plant. Where are you? I'm in Brazil. Oh, really? Who are you doing that for? Well, Rastetter. I see. How many plants are you going to build down there for him? Well, they were at 2 done and 1 started, and they were planning on going to 6 ethanol plants in Brazil. Now, I tell you this because this is a man that's going to save Iowa ethanol, right? And so this process is, a lot of this now is public knowledge that's been published, and Rastetter himself has said it. So what I'm going to tell you, I don't really need to qualify as just being a judgment call, unless my memory is questionable. But they're building 6 ethanol plants down there that's documented that 3 of them are done. They're about 150 million gallons each. And in an interview with him that's published, he said, okay, we're planning on putting 1.2 billion gallons of ethanol on the market down here with our operation. And I know from looking up the records that it's Mato Grosso, the western province or state of Brazil, a big ag state in Brazil. The western state, let's just say a dozen years ago, its corn production was 377 million bushels a year. And when this interview came down from Rastetter now a couple of years ago, their production was up to 1.2 billion bushels of corn a year. And he said that they expect it to go to 4 billion bushels. And they're clearing trees down there right and left and burning them and pumping CO2 up into the atmosphere, by the way. And so I look at this and I think, if you're going to put 1.2 billion gallons of ethanol on the marketplace and 4 billion bushel of corn into the global market in the process of doing that, and by the way, he's got a permit to drill a well, presumably to explore for how he could pump CO2 down into the formations in Brazil. So that whole operation down there doesn't do a thing to help ethanol here in the United States. Instead, it's direct competition. So he comes here and says, I'm going to save that ethanol, and he goes down there and creates a huge bunch of competition. But the way this all fits together is that if he would have carbon credits in Brazil for what comes out of these ethanol plants. What I didn't tell you, and I think a lot of you will know, though, the 57 ethanol plants that he wants to hook together, they produce a very pure form of CO2. When you go by the ethanol plant and you see that vapor going up into the atmosphere, people from a distance think that's smoke. Well, that's water vapor, but in that is CO2. And the CO2 settles down out of that water vapor and really goes to the ground and spreads out, and corn shoots up, green and robust. But that CO2 coming out of the ethanol plants represents, as near as I can determine, the largest mass of the purest form of CO2 known anywhere in the world. You don't have to scrub it out of the air. It's already there, concentrated, 98 point something % pure. And they say that in their own meetings as far recently as last night. So if he's got control of the control of the CO2 out of the ethanol plants, and Uncle Sam puts a floor price of $85 a metric ton out there, then and he's got the carbon credits. He doesn't have to sell them to we, the people, the taxpayers, borrow the money from China to pay for it, by the way. Instead, he can hang on to those carbon credits and sell them on the international market. Or he can decide that, well, they're not going to go for sequestration in North Dakota, but it's just a little switch over here. So one of his partners, Harold Hamm, the founder of fracking, put $250 million into this endeavor. He's sitting up there with those oil fields in North Dakota. He needs the CO2 for fracking. So if Harold Hamm and the frackers want to outbid Uncle Sam at $85, they're going to end up with that CO2 for fracking in North Dakota. If the international market for credits is higher than $85, Rastetter will sell them to maybe a freight company like Maersk, the largest container ship company in the world, and they need to get their carbon index down. So another piece of this, so I guess maybe to bring it together is this, as much as I've shaken this down and looked at it over and over again, at its root, the only thing that makes sense is this is 100% government funded. If somebody tells you they're going to get $1 or $3 more for a bushel of corn, I can tell you we're going to subsidize that bushel of corn for $3.71. And that's a hard number, not a speculative number. So I don't want to have an economy that's going to live off of Uncle Sam like that. I want to buy, sell, trade, make, gain, produce, compete, and things will balance out in our system. So this whole network is for Bruce Rastetter is so that he can have the equivalent of a monopoly control on that largest mass of purest form of CO2 known anywhere in the world. And if he can do that, he can strangle the ethanol plants. He can decide when to turn the valve on, when to turn it off. He can turn it over to the frackers in North Dakota, and that $85, so it goes down to $60, so they have to bid that back up. But what happens to the money that would go to the ethanol plant? If that doesn't go for sequestration, their subsidy goes to zero. And he would be in control of that, although we don't get to read those contracts, so maybe there's something in there that protects him. I also know that the first contract is coming up for expiration in December. That's just around the corner. Another one in February. And I don't see any reason these ethanol plants that are privately owned would sign on again. And even if it turns out that this is going to happen, if you sit back and wait, you're going to get the best deal at the end. So it's about a monopoly control. And I didn't say also China. Man. I can get to an end, Gerald. I can, but okay. I'll try not to even use that. But thank you, you're generous. Anyway, and this funding, we're what, $34-35 trillion in debt, and so we're borrowing money from China. There is, I believe, Chinese investment in this. They put Syngenta and Smithfield on their website as their partners. And so they tell me that they're not investors after I called them out publicly, but I'm not sure I believe these guys. Anyway, think of this. Chinese money invested, LLCs, you can't look and see who the investors are in LLCs. There's a lid on that. And so we can't know until, we just can't know. And so let's just presume that there is a lot of Chinese investment. That's what Terry Branstad has been in business for. That's his consulting company. That's why he formed that consulting company. So the Chinese invest in Summit, presumably. And then we pay the carbon credits, and then out of those carbon credits into Summit, the dividends get paid to the investors. Who are the investors? Some of them, I believe, are Chinese. And so we borrow money from China to pay for our debt, and then we use that money to pay Summit, that uses that money to pay the Chinese and the dividends. And this whole circle, and while that's going on, we're buying equipment from China, and our solar panels are almost all of them coming from China, and they're bleeding us, just bleeding us dry. That's all got to be reversed, and we've got to restore free enterprise, and we've got to build this greater country, and we can do that if we secure the borders, protect our babies, restore free enterprise and property rights and constitutional rights, and God bless you all, I'm going to stop. So
Well, if your head's not spinning yet, you weren't listening. No, very good. Excellent. lots of, it's too bad we didn't have half the county here tonight to listen and hear what's going on in this greater situation in the country.